Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Dissidents and Dictators, flagship podcast from the Human Rights Foundation. My name is Casey Michelle, and we have a fantastic guest today. Evan Mawarire is many things: a Zimbabwean clergyman, the director of the Frontlines of Freedom program at the Renewed Democracy Initiative, and an activist who jump-started one of the most successful democratic movements in Southern Africa, and someone who was imprisoned for his efforts. He is also, without a doubt, one of the most charismatic voices you'll ever hear, so stay tuned. Evan, it is great to have you with us today. First things first, where are you calling in from today?
Casey, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be speaking with you guys again. So I am somewhere in the United States. That's always my standard answer. I'm somewhere in the United States. But yeah, I work a lot out of DC and New York. So yeah, I'm based in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, right. Well, look, it's a big country, plenty of options, plenty of different places to see and visit and work from out there. I was going to say, Evan, the reason that I was so excited to have you on today is because I actually saw you speak here in New York just a few weeks ago at the Renewed Democracy Initiative Gala, which is why, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, you are without a doubt one of the most charismatic voices I have certainly ever heard in person, and certainly some of the other folks who have been able to listen to share that same assessment. When I saw you talk, you were sharing your story, your personal story, your personal history, how you ended up working in this broader democracy space, but also your particular journey, your training as a clergyman, your work as a democracy activist in Zimbabwe. Obviously now you're here in the United States. I don't want to ask you to go into every single detail, but can you give us kind of a primer of what your story is, and especially how it relates to how you communicate? Again, you have this training as a clergyman. Is this something that you have always found yourself drawn to, this kind of public speaking, this charisma to bring new people into these audiences, to reach audiences with your story and why democracy is just so important on this planet?
My journey, Casey, starts with a huge desire as a teenager to help people. And that was because I went to a school at a certain point in my life, a school that my dad sent me to that had nothing. I mean, it was a bare bones of a school. We had just a couple of buildings on the campus, if I can even call it a campus. And what that meant is that some classes would have to be taken under trees. And, we didn't have any running water. There was no electricity installed at that place. I remember the one thing that really gave me this desire of one day, if I make it in life, I want to help people, was that I was learning with students that would walk up to 15 miles a day just to get to school. And these students would do really well academically. And what was heartbreaking is that when they couldn't afford the fees for their final examinations or graduation examinations, they had to drop out. And so since then, I had this desire of, if I could speak for someone else, if I could get into a room where I could represent other people, I want to do it well. And so that journey led me on then to becoming a pastor many years later. And of course, being a pastor meant that I was in front of an audience every single week, speaking to people, starting with young people. And that just became a passion of mine, talking to people or convincing people concerning something good, something positive. And so I cultivated that. And when the movement began, it just so happened that I had this skill that I had been developed over years.
Well, so for a little bit more context, this is you growing up back in Zimbabwe at the time.
Yes, this is me growing up back in Zimbabwe.
We'll talk about Zimbabwean politics here in a minute or two. Was your father a clergyman? Was it in your family? Was there, or perhaps another member of the clergy that you looked up to at the time? Was there a model you were trying to form yourself upon?
Yeah, my dad was a layman in the church. And so whilst he was not a full pastor or a trained pastor or an installed pastor, he always played a role as a supporting leader in the church, that he was constantly either up speaking or constantly hosting small groups of people, and many of those were in our home, by the way. These small groups would be in our home. And so I watched that. I was part of all of that and learned a lot from watching my dad reach the hearts of people, because that's the core of the work when you are in the church world.
Right. And it's also cultivating and strengthening that community right there. Again, whether it's within the church or in the city, the town, the region itself. Because again, we'll talk about this later in the conversation, democracy at the end of the day is the cultivation, the strengthening, and the representation of that community itself, which it sounds like is something you were attracted to from a young age in terms of, again, trying to or attempting to speak on behalf of or provide a voice for those who don't necessarily have the voices or the resources at the end of the day to continue their own careers, to thrive. So you go through this training, and again, I'm kind of speeding things up because we only have a little bit on the podcast today. You go through this training, you end up as a clergyman. You have your own church that you were speaking to week in and week out. When does that, or how does that intersect with or build upon this desire for, or this need for, democracy promotion, democracy activism? When does that seed also kind of set in for you?
Well, the seed sets in as I'm pastoring young people in Zimbabwe, and I'm seeing that the number one need that young people have is this desire to do well for themselves. These young people that have ideas, they're creative, and they're trying their best to think big, but they're failing to really grow and to do anything, primarily because of the way Zimbabwe was. The way Zimbabwe was in two ways: one, economically, and secondly, politically. And so I realized this pastoring, years ago, way before I started the movement. But because I was scared, like many people were, to speak truth to power, I figured out other ways of, so how else can I help young people? And so the idea for me began, how do I prepare young people to be leaders? How do I prepare them to be change makers? How do I prepare them to be, kind of conveners of a community, and things like that? And so that's where my work began. And like I said, because of how scared I was, and because of how scared many people were, for good reason, to challenge the dictatorship in Zimbabwe, you had two choices. You either found a way to do it, or you just mind your own business. And so I began to do that, but also, there was a sense of minding my own business as well, because you can only do so much when you're trying to change a system like that.
I think this phenomenon of seeing this younger generation growing up and realizing there is this ceiling that they can reach this and go no further because of that authoritarian governance. Again, that is not unique to Zimbabwe's experience. We see this in authoritarian regimes all around the world. But I do think, and I would love to hear you, I suppose, talk a little bit more about the figure of Robert Mugabe, who does seem like this, even in the world of dictators, even in the world of authoritarian regimes, stood out for the lengths that he and his regime would go to stifle dissent, to smother political opposition, to say nothing of the kind of economic devastation he wrought upon Zimbabwe. Can you give folks, I think folks maybe tangentially familiar with Mugabe as a figure, obviously no longer in power. Can you give us a little bit about who Mugabe was, what his regime was, and what it did to Zimbabweans?
One of the things that Robert Mugabe did for years in Zimbabwe when he was president, and by the way, he was president in Zimbabwe for 37 years, and that was from independence. So Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, and Robert Mugabe was president until 2017. He then died later on in 2018, I believe it was, and he was 93 at the time that he was still president in 2017. But one of the things that Robert Mugabe and his party championed, apart from the brutal violence that they brought in Zimbabwe, the political violence, stolen elections, the crushing of dissent, of dissenters, the brutalization of anyone who challenged them politically or otherwise. Apart from all of that, one of the things they championed was the fact that if you did not fight in the war with them, you were not qualified to lead in Zimbabwe. Now, how many people would have been alive by 2010, 20 whatever? For you to be able to say, yes, I fought in the war, therefore I can lead. So their philosophy was, if you did not participate in the liberation struggle from 1960, the late 60s until the late 70s, you're not qualified to lead in Zimbabwe. And that shut out a whole generation of people from leading, a whole generation of people from participating, in Zimbabwe. But I think part of the biggest tragedy of what then happened with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe was that he was willing to allow a country to lose its economy completely, to the point where, for example, in 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation was running at 286 million%. It meant that our largest banknote at that time during that hyperinflation period was a $100 trillion note. And here's the thing, Casey.
Yeah.
And I know this is crazy to try and how do you
fit all the zeros on the bill?
You can. I actually have a note somewhere here on my desk. But I'm always showing people and always reminding people what it was like.
Oh, there it is.
There it is right there, right?
Incredible.
So these guys had the audacity to fit 14 zeros onto one note and force us to use it. But I actually remember when in 2008 and I tried to go and buy bread with it, and I could only buy a loaf of bread. It wasn't even enough for that loaf, actually, because the time that I was standing in line to buy that bread, the price kept on going up. That's how this was the way inflation. It was not inflation that you waited until the end of the year to hear the figures. It was inflation that you got the rising figures of by the hour. Okay, so this was the biggest tragedy. But of course, the ripple effect of that meant that our health delivery system was completely destroyed. Our education system was completely destroyed. Our infrastructure was completely destroyed in Zimbabwe. And so people were ravaged by disease. They were ravaged by, all manner of, ailments in Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe would himself and his family not use the local hospitals for treatment. Him and his family flew out to Singapore, where they were treated. In fact, that's where he actually later died. But for his whole life, Robert Mugabe would fly the national airline to go to Singapore to get checkups and to get treatment. So this is the depth to which this dictator had sunk. There is not enough time for me to tell you, Casey, the level of brutality that Robert Mugabe brought to Zimbabwe. In 2008, I'll tell you just one. He lost the election to the opposition, and Robert Mugabe just refused to leave. He said, I'm not going to go. I'm just going to stay as president. That incident alone hits a blow to the hope of democracy in Zimbabwe in ways that are difficult to explain. And to top that, he went into the communities of people that had voted against him and punished them with punishments such as giving them a choice to choose whether their arm that they used to vote would be chopped off at the wrist or at the elbow. They used to call that long sleeve or short sleeve. This is how bad this man was. And at the height of all of that, he still believed that he was he was the legitimate leader of Zimbabwe and was okay to lead Zimbabwe. And by the time that he was 93, wanted to hand over leadership over to his wife.
I mean, there's a reason that Mugabe stands out even in the history of dictatorship, not only in the region, but globally itself. I mean, obviously we have Dos Santos in Angola, we have King Mswati in Swaziland. I mean, it's not that there aren't other dictatorships in the region, but what Mugabe did for years, the devastation he wrought, the violence he wrought in Zimbabwe, I have no doubt Zimbabweans are obviously still recovering from, but that pressure, especially among the younger generations, such as yourself, growing and growing and growing. So I want to bring things back to you and your story within this. By the early to mid 2010s, there is increasing discontent, there is increasing pressure building, there is increasing destabilization, obviously not only economically, but politically as well, and potential openings therein. Where does this come for you? Where do you begin to see this reality, these openings, this potential for you yourself as a potential political, maybe not figure, but certainly force. Can you talk to us a little bit about the This Flag movement that began in the mid-2010s and your role and your relationship therein?
Actually, Casey, this flag actually began 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And up until then, I did not in any way, shape, or form see myself as a political figure. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say this is that it was not just me, it was the majority of ordinary citizens in Zimbabwe. We had been conditioned over years to not want to get involved in politics in Zimbabwe. And Robert Mugabe did this intentionally. He did it by brutalizing anybody that stood up to him and doing it openly. And the messaging then became very, very open and very direct. Do not get into politics. Do not speak against the president. Do not speak against ZANU-PF, the party that the president leads. And so for years, this had become our conditioning. In fact, many of us, I'm writing my book at the moment, and one of the things I mention in there is the legacy of fear that we were handed from our parents. And our parents, handed that to us because of the experiences they had with Robert Mugabe in the early 80s even. And so by the time I'm an adult, and I'm looking after my own family, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. And in fact, a lot of what people my age are thinking of doing is leaving Zimbabwe altogether because you don't want to stay there. You want to go where there are better opportunities. But in 2016, by the time we get to 2016, and I've watched this economic destruction happen where my parents lost everything that they had. They were retired in 2008. And when the economy crashed, it wiped everything out, everything. It wiped out the little that I had as well. And so by the time we get into 2016, Zimbabwe was going through another cycle of an economic crash. So can you imagine, after having quote unquote recovered from the $100 trillion mess, we all have these little and little valuable savings that we've put away. We start to lose them again. It's at that point that I realized that, no, I'm not going to let the same people that stole my father's dream, that stole my dream, because by then my dream is completely stolen. I'm not going to allow them to steal my children's dream because now I have children. At that very point, Casey, it becomes personal. And I have to be honest here to say that when I started, I didn't start this movement with the grand vision of, you can't do this to Zimbabwe, this is terrible. I started off with the feeling of, you can't do this to my family, you can't do this to my children. And then out of that, then grew what became the movement. And it was accidental as well, because it was, first of all, when I made the call and made that first video, I was saying to Zimbabweans, why are we quiet when this is happening to our nation? And so that then blew the movement up.
Evan, I think part of that reason, part of that success is because there are so many others in Zimbabwe and obviously globally as well that can relate to that feeling that, no, this regime, this dictator cannot do this to my children, cannot do this to my family, cannot do this to the people that I care about. And of course, that has these ripple effects or domino effect or whatever the metaphor may be, where you start small and it just cascades into this movement that ends up helping take down this dictator itself. Can you talk to us, Evan, briefly about, and we can have a link in the show notes to this video that you posted, and I believe it was on social media initially, again, thinking back to the mid-2010s, Facebook, Instagram, obviously these are still with us, but especially at the time being very prominent tools themselves. Can you tell us about this video that initially launched you to this position of prominence and had such an effect in Zimbabwe?
So, obviously I'm part of a generation that, was learning how to use these new social media tools, things that were not present in years gone by as, our nation was developing. And so by 2015, 2016, a lot of people in my generation, we all have Facebook pages, we have Twitter handles, and we're learning to use these tools. And one of the things I had done was to use my Facebook page for my church work. So on this particular day, I thought to myself, well, I've recorded short videos before talking about, the work that we do as a church and talking to our community of church members. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to record a short video that literally expresses my frustration at Zimbabwe. That video was actually not meant for our church community. It's one that I just put out there. And I just said, listen, I don't know if anyone else is going. I feel like I'm alone here. I don't know if everyone else is making it. And so I put that video out. It was not scripted. I was not prepared. I remember sitting in my church office thinking about how to pay school fees for my children, and it just wasn't working for me at that time. I took my phone, I propped it up against my Bible on my desk. You'll see as you watch the video that I'm actually crouching down into the frame to fit into the frame, of this video. And I just let loose. And I begin to talk about if we desire, and if you listen, you'll hear me talk about the central message being, if we desire change in Zimbabwe, then we must show up. Then we must say something. And again, in that video, and when we started, it was not about removing the dictatorship. It was not about even saying to them, we want you gone. It was about saying, you guys have got to fix this country. If you're leading it, if you're saying you're responsible for leading, then fix it. And these are the issues. Like, this is really simple.
And I think what was most remarkable about that is that the regime listened to you clearly, came out in full support of you, and affected all these changes, correct? This was a very positive response from the regime to your video?
Well, I think that is what you would wish would happen.
That's what we would want, certainly.
And of course, the direct opposite of everything you've just said is exactly what happened. I was demonized as a terrorist. I was accused of trying to overthrow the government at the time. I was accused of being funded by the Western governments. I was accused of being a CIA agent, and it just spiraled. And the thing is that as the accusations increased on me, it started becoming a lot more obvious to the ordinary person that this government actually doesn't care about its citizens and will listen to nobody. We had seen them ignore opposition politicians, and that's kind of normal that they would ignore those guys. But when ordinary people speak up and say, listen, we don't want your power, we don't want anything, we just want things to change, and you still don't listen, and then you go after that particular person, it starts to send a message to everyone else that, wait, we actually don't care at all about how you guys feel.
And this is a theme that we've talked about in podcast episodes past with democracy activists elsewhere. It is when a regime targets those that are simply speaking up for their basic democratic rights, attempts to censor them, attempts to smother them, that folks, again, realize just what lengths these regimes are going to go to, and very often ends up backfiring on the regime itself. So, Evan, take us through more of your story, though. You have this video. It is circulating already. It is becoming more and more popular. Obviously, plenty of other Zimbabweans can relate to that sense of frustration for yourself, for your family. The regime attempts to silence you. They accuse you of these truly heinous crimes, terrorism, attempting to overthrow the regime. Evan, I should say, I've also been accused of being a CIA agent in the past. I don't know where you and I find the time, so it's very nice to meet a fellow colleague right there. You end up, though, I mean, again, things become, we're laughing, obviously, which is wonderful here in 2024, but things get very serious for you very quickly. It becomes no laughing matter. Can you tell us what happens?
Well, that first video went wildly viral, like you said. And I think I started to realize during that time that, wait, this is more than just a video that people are excited about. There are things in here that people are identifying with, and this is becoming a platform. Just that one video, it became a platform through which people began to speak up about the way they felt. So I gathered a few friends of mine, some of them actually volunteered at the time, and I began to do more videos. And I remember doing a video a day for 25 days from the 1st of May to the 25th of May. We've just come out of the anniversary of that campaign that we did back in 2016, actually. And the goal for me was, I realized that many of you don't know how to speak out. I'm listening to what you're saying, and I realized that many of you, like me, are scared. So here's what I'm going to do is, for the next 25 days, I'm going to do a 3-minute video every single day telling you why it's important for people like you and me to speak up. telling you what's wrong with our country and what our constitution empowers you and me as ordinary citizens to do. Because it's not like we didn't have a constitution. We did a good constitution with the Bill of Rights that gave citizens the rights and the tools to be able to either support their government or to hold them accountable, because that's what citizens do. That's what citizens should be doing in a country. So those videos were wildly successful, but the government wasn't listening. And in fact, they continued to threaten me and so forth. And then eventually they decided that they were going to introduce a new currency in Zimbabwe. At that point, that's when I said to citizens, listen, we can't just be talking online. If we're a real movement and if we're serious about this, I'm going to ask you to be bold. Now is the time. The time has now come. I'm going to ask you to take one step with me. And it's a protest. Now in Zimbabwe, it's illegal to protest on the street. You cannot go on the street and protest without the permission of the government. You cannot protest the government without permission from the government, which is really stupid, right? Because the whole idea of protest is that it is the empowerment that citizens have to be able to call their own leaders out when those leaders are making a mistake, because leaders always make mistakes. No one is perfect. So here I am, and I made a video, and I said, listen, we now must protest, but I'm not going to ask you to get on the street because I know that's scary and I know it's dangerous. Here's what I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask you to take one day in the week, in the next 2 days. It was on July 4th when I made this call. I said on the 6th of July, 2016, I'm asking every Zimbabwean, if you've heard my voice, if you're hearing my voice, if you can send my voice to anybody, let them know that on the 6th of July, we're shutting Zimbabwe down. You and me are going to shut the entire country down and bring it to a complete standstill. How are we going to do that? I'm asking you to stay at home. I'm asking you not to go to work, not to open your business, not to take your kids to school. I'm asking you not to get on the street. I'm asking you to park your cars and stay in your homes. You can't be arrested for that. You can't be fired for doing that. You can't be sent away from school for missing one day, just one day. These people need to understand who actually holds the power. And that was my call. Now, take notes here, Casey. I pastor a church of 35 people, and I'm asking a nation of 14 million people to stay at home.
But who am I? This is Evan. This is the genius of that move, because again, you're not asking them to commit any crimes, even as silly and ridiculous as some of those crimes may be. Simply staying home and reminding them, having them remember that they have that voice. They have those constitutional rights, and acting in concert, acting in cohort with one another, they can speak far louder than the regime ever can.
Exactly. And these things you're saying, Casey, I am learning these things as I'm saying them at the time, because it's a journey I'd never walked. This is a space I had never considered to enter. So as I'm learning these things, I'm beginning to teach them, and I'm beginning to send them out. I'm beginning to say to citizens, I discovered our Constitution says this, that I have the right to protest, that I have the right to hold government accountable, to support or to question government policy, right? And it was amazing to embark on that journey. I remember when the day came, and the few friends of mine and I, we were not sure whether this was going to work, because you don't have an indication, a real indication that it's going to work. And the day came, and I'll never forget this for as long as I live. I remember going out. I was staying in a safe house now on that particular day because we feared I would get arrested. And I remember going out secretly. I still have the video where I drove around the city of Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe, and the whole thing was completely shut down. There was nobody. It was in the middle of the week, and the whole thing came to a complete standstill. Nobody, silent. It was completely empty. And we then discovered that over 12 million people had responded to that call, because all across the country, people had stayed at home and they had participated in this protest.
Well, that's over 25% of the country. And obviously that's including a population with plenty of children as well, who are listening to their parents. I mean, Evan, what was going through your mind when you drove around Harare? Was it Was it bizarre? Was it eerie? Was it rewarding? Was it, I mean, obviously it's unprecedented. What were you feeling when you looked around and saw, frankly, nothing?
It was all of those things, Casey. It was exciting. It was inspiring. It was terrifying.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, it was eerie. It was the thought of, wait, what just happened here? Did they listen to what I did? So they got it? Like, wait a minute. People are not scared. I mean, they are scared, but people are willing. There is a willingness here. And so those thoughts are going through my mind. But I've got to tell you that by far the most dominant thought was, I'm in trouble.
Yeah, of course.
I am now in a lot of trouble with what we've just done.
Well,
here.
if Mugabe didn't know who you were before, if his cabinet, his administration didn't know who you were before, at that point, they absolutely do. How do they respond to these protests? How do they respond to this effort that you were helping lead, you were helping coordinate?
Well, a few days later, they issued a warrant for my arrest, and I was eventually arrested. They threatened my family as well, and eventually I was arrested and thrown into prison. And there I was charged with attempting to overthrow the government. That was the first charge. It was a treason charge. I was facing 20 years in prison. They found guilty. And on the first 2 nights of my stay in the prison, there's a prison cell at Harare Central Police Station that is actually nicknamed Baghdad. And it was nicknamed Baghdad back in the day when Baghdad had been shelled and completely destroyed in the war, if you remember, many years ago. And so it was nicknamed Baghdad because of its filthiness, because of its inhospitable nature, and also because of the torture that takes place there. And in those 2 nights, I was beaten, I was abused, and I was interrogated for pretty much every night that I was in there. And though that was difficult, it is what happened on the day that I was to appear in court 2 days later that was a big reward for me. It overshadowed the pain. The pain was real, but this was soothing. And what happened is this: people began to gather at the courts on my day of trial. And because I had done that first video holding the Zimbabwe flag, which you can see behind me here, the movement was actually called This Flag Movement because it stemmed from the story that the Zimbabwe flag tells. Each color has a meaning. And throughout the building of the movement, I had said to Zimbabweans, we must reclaim the meaning of this flag, the promise of what this flag is all about, the prosperity, the freedom, the peace, all of that. That's what we are taught that it means, and yet we experience none of it. So every day that we watch this flag fly, it's lying, and we are agreeing with the lie. So we must reclaim it and restore that story. So that's all in that initial video, that very first video. But here I am hearing news of 100 people that have gathered at the courts with their Zimbabwe flags, singing and kneeling, demanding my release. And it blew me away. When I had been told, a police officer told me about this whilst I was in the cell. And he said, listen, we can't go to the court just yet. It's about 100 people there. We're going to send the riot police to clear them out. And it was so heartening to hear that news. But that was just the beginning, because hour after hour, this police officer kept coming back, and he would show me videos and pictures of the growing crowd. And he would say, hey, man, we're going to wait again. That crowd has grown. There's 300 people. Hey, man, that crowd has grown. There's 600 people. Hey, that crowd has grown. There's 1,000. By the time I went to court, which was at 7 p.m., by the way, I was supposed to be in court by 8 a.m. 7 p.m. was the time that I finally went to court. There were 10,000 people that were gathered at the courts. Even now I feel like bursting into tears because of that moment, because it was just an amazing moment in the journey.
And each and every one of those people taking a decision of bravery, a step of bravery. Of course they are scared. Of course they are concerned. They see what is happening to you. I was going to say, Evan, I think this is maybe one of the most ironic things of them charging you with treason in that you had actually launched one of the most patriotic movements in Zimbabwean history, honoring the flag, honoring Zimbabwe's story. Of course, the democratic underpinnings of that, the democratic rights of all Zimbabweans. Again, I guess I just can't get over that irony, because in their eyes, treason is just going against the regime rather than, of course, what it actually is going against the state and the people itself. So we have 10,000. Oh, go ahead, Evan.
Do you know one of the things, sir, and I just wanted to mention this when you talk about, launching this movement that was patriotic and not treasonous. One of the things that they did was actually in a bid to stop people from onboarding onto the movement, because the flag had we had turned the flag into being a symbol of resistance. So one of the things that they actually did along the way is they actually banned the Zimbabwe flag in Zimbabwe.
I shouldn't laugh. Of course they're going to do that. And again, as if these dictatorships aren't ridiculous in and of themselves. I mean, what a move. What a ridiculous move for them to make. But
it was amazing for the movement, you see, because it strengthened the movement even more. And so on this particular day that people gathered, the courts demanding my release, guess what? The one thing that almost everyone has in their hands, it's the Zimbabwean flag.
Of course. And again, at the end of the day, it is the This Flag movement that you are now at the center of. But your court case is still ongoing. Of course, they still control the courts themselves. Evan, can you take us through what happened next?
Well, what happens next for me is part of the big miracle. People begin to gather not just at this particular court, but they begin to gather at the other regional courts across the country. And so essentially what's happening is that the citizenry is now self-mobilizing. I love this moment again because it is not a call to action that I made. It's one that citizens themselves decided they would do, which was a great result of our movement, because what we decided to do as a movement was not so much to shout at politicians, but to embolden citizens. In fact, our catchphrase for onboarding citizens became, if we cannot cause the politician to change, then we must inspire the citizen to be bold. And that became where our energy went, emboldening citizens. And so by this evening, people refused to go home. They're bringing candles for a night vigil. People are making food at home to come and distribute at at this kind of standoff for people to stay the whole night. And so they eventually decide to let me go that night, which was unprecedented. They decide to let me go on a technicality, and they say, well, we're going to let him go because the police didn't do their job properly of investigating and so forth. But what actually was happening is that they were preparing a fresh warrant of arrest, and I was going to be arrested early the next morning. We got news of this, believe it or not, through a police chaplain who obviously being a man of the cloth himself, identified with me as a pastor. And this police chaplain sent a secret message through and said, he's going to be rearrested in the morning. You guys do what you will with that information. I'm just letting you know that your celebration is short-lived, because the whole country, at least the whole city of Harare, had broken into a huge block party after I was released. And so that night I packed a small bag, grabbed my passport. I'm driven 6 hours across the border, across to a small border, and I then make good my escape through that small border. Dramatic story, leaving the country. My family leaves through another route. We rendezvous in South Africa. We think we're safe at that point, but at that point, that's when Robert Mugabe publicly now comes out. And he makes, in a speech, he then says, people like Evan Mawarire do not belong in this country. They must go wherever they're being funded. We've also then found out whilst I was in South Africa that the government was now beginning to apply to Interpol for a red notice to have me extradited and brought back. And we felt that the possibility of that happening was very high. And so we took off and we landed in the United States of America. The thing about all of this, Casey, let me just say before I stop for a little bit, is we had been teaching people to speak truth to power. And up to that point, this had worked. And here I am having run away. Now, I was safe in the US when I got here. My family was safe, thank God for that. But there was a sense of responsibility I couldn't shake off with the movement that we had started. And so I was here in the US for 6 months in exile. And eventually I turned to my wife and I said, listen, I cannot be here right now, not with the work that we started. So I will ask you permission to let me go back. You guys can stay here with the family, but I must go back to Zimbabwe.
Well, Evan,
And
I was going to say, I'm glad you asked her permission, because I can only imagine how upset she would have been otherwise had you decided on your own.
Well, I can tell you this, that, she was very gracious, because that it was a very, very hard request to make of someone after having escaped. You're in a foreign country and now you're asking to go back to a place where you know that you are a wanted individual. And so, I always think of that moment, and I'm thankful for it. And so I made my way back to Zimbabwe. And I remember that being possibly the longest flight I have ever taken in my life, just thinking about what could happen. And people have always asked me, well, why did you do it? Why would you go back? Why would you? The thing is difficult to explain. I remember when Alexei Navalny went back, and I actually wrote a piece about him going back, because people were asking, why did he go back? And I said, I know exactly why he's gone back, because I did the same. And I went back because the responsibility of inspiring people means that you model what you say. We were trying to raise a new generation of people that no longer feared the dictator. Here's the thing that dictators love the most, Casey. Dictators love to be feared. It's their one drug of choice. They love that, to be feared. But also, here's the one thing that dictators hate the most. It is not to be feared. They hate that so much that when you don't, that's why, when Alexei went back, Vladimir Putin immediately imprisoned him, because he was mad at the fact that how dare you do that? And so when I arrived back in Zimbabwe, 1st February 2017, through to the nature of the dictatorship, I was arrested immediately on arrival. I was taken off the plane, I was stripped naked right in the airport in a back room. I was beaten, I was interrogated, and then immediately I was taken away. And this time I was held in a maximum security prison.
I was going to say, Evan, I think there is, and look, you're exactly right about Navalny, and I'm not spoiling anything by sharing with listeners that Navalny is the Human Rights Foundation's inaugural winner of the Thulani Maseko Human Rights Lawyer Prize. Maseko, again, being an assassinated human rights lawyer in Swaziland, standing up again for democratic rights, using the law for the furtherance of democratic provisions. I mean,
I met Thulani, yes.
Yes. Oh, I wish I had the opportunity. We had his wife, Danele, on the podcast not long ago to talk about how she has continued his work as well. But again, it is the kind of international cross-border connections and those democratic movements and activists inspiring those in completely different places around the world who are nonetheless suffering and struggling under similar authoritarian regimes themselves. I wanted to say, Evan, though, I think there is, again, it's kind of a delicious irony because, as you mentioned, Mugabe wanted nothing else than for years to be feared. And it is then at the end of his life when he thinks, I imagine, that he has made it so far, he is beloved and feared by Zimbabweans around the country, when he is suddenly realizing that is not his legacy whatsoever because of figures and voices and forces like yourself who are making him realize, again, at the very end of his life, of his 90, I don't know how he made it 93 years, God willing the rest of us make it that long, realizing that is not at all what his legacy will be. All of a sudden, you are, though, imprisoned. You do not know what the future holds. But Mugabe's regime is also teetering. It's also toppling over at the same time. I guess I'm wondering, how much information are you actually getting when you're in prison about what is taking place politically in Zimbabwe, in Harare, about what is happening to Mugabe himself?
Well, it was actually quite surprising to me how much information filtered into the prison from what was happening, outside. And one of the things I quickly found out when I arrived at the maximum security prison is that many of the prisoners actually knew who I was. They had heard. The news had filtered through into the prison system, either through new prisoners who came in or through prison guards. Because remember, one thing that people forget, prison guards and police officers are citizens too. They are not part of the high echelons of the political elites who are enjoying the fruits of corruption and the fruits of being part of the inner circle. These are ordinary people that are also suffering. They're also failing to provide food for their families. So they also kind of murmur and complain. And when they meet someone who has stood up to the system, they themselves are excited. They themselves want to also add in their 2 cents. So they're the ones who would bring the news in of, hey, did you hear this happened? Hey, look at this video of what's going on outside.
It's funny. I'm reminded of another episode that we did with a Russian activist who was talking about how the prison guards that she got to know were watching Navalny's videos because, again, it's the same thing. They have children to feed. They have family to feed and support.
Exactly.
And they are not at the upper levels of the regime itself, and with the yachts and the mansions and the villas in southern France and so on and so forth. So they are getting this information back to you. But again, things in Zimbabwe are suddenly at an inflection point, and you are right there in the middle of it. So how does that actually play out?
Well, I was eventually moved. I moved out of the maximum security prison on bail and was essentially under house arrest. I had to report to the police station 3 times a day for months on end. They took my passport. They took the title deeds to my parents' home make sure that and the idea was the pain of my crime, quote unquote crime, should be felt not only by me, but by my larger circle of people I cared about. So this was an attempt to really increase the cost of my activism and increase the cost of my speaking out. But at this point, as you rightly say, Robert Mugabe himself is facing an internal mutiny in his own party. And they were upset at the fact that he wanted to hand over power to his wife and his military friends, the ones whom he had stood with to say, if you did not fight in the liberation struggle, you cannot lead. They now say to him, how is it you want to give your young wife power? So we're not going to have it. We're going to kick you out. And at this point, they were finding it. They were figuring out how they would kick him out of power. And we saw an opportunity. Even though I was out on bail, I remember reaching out to some of the people who were who were organizing this ouster. And I said, listen, I don't normally talk to people like you, but there's a chance here for us to see a new Zimbabwe. You know that I've been organizing protests. You know that I'm under arrest. We would like to mobilize millions of people to get on the street to do the one thing Robert Mugabe did not allow us to do, which is to protest him. And we want to show him that we want to see his back. We want to see him gone. And so for a brief moment, there was this strange alliance between citizens and the same military that had backed Robert Mugabe. And part of the idea was, it was not just me, there was opposition politicians and their parties were involved as well. They wanted to see the back of Mugabe. And the idea was that we would then institute a new Zimbabwe. We would put together, hopefully, a transitional government of some sort, or we would go to elections, and Zimbabwe would become what Robert Mugabe did not allow it to do. And of course, eventually, Robert Mugabe has to leave office because the military is on the street. Although they're not shooting guns, there's millions of people on the street demanding Robert Mugabe should leave. And so he's left with no choice and he leaves. We all break into jubilation. I mean, Casey, if I have to tell you, seeing Robert Mugabe go is something that most Zimbabweans did not think that they would live to see. So to be able to see him leave power in our lifetime was beyond, the euphoria. I remember crying tears on the day that Robert Mugabe announced he was leaving, because we'd actually been on the streets trying to mobilize people to protest. And I'd come back home tired. And then the news came in, he has resigned. And I just broke down and cried because the one thing we wanted the most happened. What was really unfortunate was that although Mugabe was gone, Mugabeism did not go. Although the dictator was gone, dictatorship remained. And this is where we started learning the hard lesson that it's a system and not an individual. That yes, whilst Robert Mugabe was responsible as a leader, what really now was running the whole thing was a system of dictatorship. And we learned this because the military then installed their own person who happened to be the vice president to Robert Mugabe. And that's where the fight was between those two. He became president and Zimbabwe went straight back into being a dictatorship again. And it was a very, very tough and bitter pill to swallow. And I'll close on this one by saying that when he started to repress our rights again and take us back into what Mugabe did, we organized yet another protest. And I remember this was in January of 2019 now. I'd been protesting and organizing protests and building the movement for almost 3 years from 2016. And here we are in 2019 and Zimbabwe is going backwards again, even with a new president. And so I got together with the trade unions in Zimbabwe. And I said, listen, guys, you saw what we did in 2016 when we shut the country down. Let's do it again, even to this new pass, to understand early in the game. What we did, the problem, the challenge we had with Mugabe, the mistake was early in the game, citizens did not come out to him to protest or to hold his feet to the fire. We've got to do it early in the game with these guys. And so we did. And on January 14, we called, this shutdown. And again, the whole country came to a complete standstill. The military was deployed against citizens. People were beaten. Women were raped and then arrested in their hundreds. I was arrested on January 16, 2019, again, and went straight back to the maximum security prison where I'd spent months before under Robert Mugabe. And now under the new president, I was charged again with attempting to overthrow the government and was locked up in that prison for months on end.
And of course, this is a story that we have seen play out elsewhere in other democratic revolutions. The ousting of a dictator does not then ipso facto mean democracy takes root. It is far beyond just one person. Again, whether it's in Zimbabwe or Angola or Tunisia or Uzbekistan, around the world, it is not just that one figure that needs to go. It is an entire regime. And democracy is not something that just happens overnight. It is a process. But even as we have just a minute or two remaining, at the end of the day, and again, I'm sure you and I could talk about domestic politics in Zimbabwe right now for another hour in and of itself. For as horrible and dictatorial as the current regime is, there is something that can never be taken away from you or from other Zimbabweans, and it is that feeling of euphoria, that success that you saw not long ago in what a people can accomplish, organized, dedicated, and doing so even despite the fear that may be there. That is proof that it can succeed. And it doesn't happen every day, it doesn't happen every year, and it doesn't even necessarily happen to every regime. But there was a success, there was a model that can always now be looked to in Zimbabwe's history to potentially turn to once again when the moment is right in Zimbabwe.
I've always said to people, Casey, and you're so right. I've always said to people in Zimbabwe that the victories for us in the journey and the work we did were many. And we still feel the effects of the victories that we had. What are those victories? First of all, the fact that we were able to mobilize a people who had been brutalized and traumatized for years. We were able to bring those people to a place where they found the courage. That's a victory for every single person that stood up to Robert Mugabe's brutality. The second thing is that we were able to carve out space within the democratic timeline or journey of Zimbabwe for citizens to participate. People who were excluded by the system fought for their space, won that space, and actually operated the levers of power available to citizens in that space. And that is our constitution. That is the rights that are enshrined in that constitution. And that, of course, is trying to bring Zimbabwe back to being a democracy as we claim we are in our constitution. But perhaps the largest, or at least the biggest piece of victory we still hold on to back then and now, is that there are more people present in Zimbabwe today who are willing to speak against the dictatorship than there was back in the day. And that is a win. There are more people whose mind has become attuned and acclimatized to speaking truth to power than we ever had. And that is a breakthrough. My hope continues that in the same way that I suddenly started, there are many other young people in Zimbabwe right now who are going to start something that is also going to change Zimbabwe in their own way. What we must do, and what we did successfully, is to play our part. Play your part so that the coming generation has somewhere to start from, and they don't have to start from where you started from. They start from where you ended. They claim those victories, and they're able to take that work going forward.
And they can look to that flag, Zimbabwe's flag, as proof of what that success can look like and what a better future can hold for Zimbabweans as well.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely, sir. A great quote I heard some time ago is that the future that we desire is in us. We are the people we have been waiting for.
That's a great quote. Evan Mawarire, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and we can't wait to have you back on again.
It's been my honor, Casey. Thank you so much for having me back with my wonderful family at HRF.
The Human Rights Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally with a focus on closed societies. We promote freedom where it's most at risk, in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes.